Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First comes off, then if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during his presentation or after his presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming dear Professor Stuart Cooper, a professor of accounting at the University of Bristol, and dear Professor Richard Slag, a professor in accounting at Durham University Business School. Now we will start our seminar with dear Professor Stuart Cooper and dear Professor Richard Slag.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Um, the structure of the presentation, just so I can cover that to start with. I'm principally going to do the front end of the presentation up to the research methods, and then Stuart will take over from the research methods and into the findings and discussion. So we're not swapping all of the time. There is one caveat to that. When we get onto the SBTi framework, Stuart's going to cover that slide. So the presentation that we are looking at, and feel free to put any questions in chat as we're going along, if there is something that you want us to discuss further as we're going, or we can have a Q&A at the end, but Stuart and I are both quite happy to take questions as we're going along as well. So Stuart and I have worked together for quite a long time, and we're both sustainability researchers, and we were really wanting to try and get a grip of how climate change was being addressed by corporations, because it's all very well that the Paris Agreement, for instance, which we'll cover, saying that we want to reduce global warming, and lots of countries signing up for that. But ultimately, it really rests upon the polluting corporations to reduce their emissions. And we've always felt that kind of good companies will do good things, but there was no real mechanism in order to achieve this, and the move from, or the translation really, from the domain of Paris Agreement and the political will through to the organizational level, that really that's where climate change needs to be addressed. So that was the sort of background to it. In terms of the recency of this, you can see from the first quote, the UN Environment Programme 2025, the science is clear. The world is in a state of climate emergency, and it needs to shift into emergency gear. I won't prove my ability to read off all the slides, but to significantly alter the composition of the atmosphere. So clearly this is a very pressing issue, bearing in mind that the Paris Agreement was 10 years before that and was adopted by 195 countries. So there is political will behind it. The current caveat probably being the USA, but we'll come to caveats as we're going along. And as I explained when I kicked the presentation off, the Paris Agreement really seeks to get temperatures well below 2 degrees above restricted to 2 degrees above pre-industrial level. But really, in the modern era, it's really got to try and be limiting the increase to 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. So even in those 10 years, in a way, the emergency of focusing on 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels has become even more fundamental. And probably some very ambitious governments would like to see that down at 1 degree. But in a way, there's got to be some form of realism over what can be achieved, sad though that may be. So there is an urgent need for stronger and more ambitious climate action. And whilst the direction of that has come from governments and political will and the social agenda, nonetheless, businesses and investors play a key role. Businesses as the emitters, and investors as the organizations that provide them with capital. And if investors buy into this, then there is a ready-made lever on the businesses to undertake the will of the investors, which we will see in due course. And everybody has a role to play in implementing the Paris Agreement, and therefore the political will and the social will needs to be translated into the organizational level in order to implement the Paris Agreement. So Stuart and I explore Science-Based Targets Initiative because one of the things at the beginning of the research, we did initially look at lots and lots of company disclosure around emissions, around climate change targets, around the subsequent reporting of those targets. And to be honest, it was all a bit of a mess. And we kept coming more and more across science-based targets as a framework that was independent of the organizations, and therefore wasn't just let's set a nice easy target that we'll meet, but rather is a target that is externally validated by the SBTi. And so we began to look more and more at this, particularly as the SBTi mission is entirely aligned with the Paris Agreement to drive science-based climate action in the corporate sector. So we can see very clearly the organizational level to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And it will achieve that through validation of science-based targets from organizations based upon the SBTi target setting framework, which is independent of organizations, but they will then be committed to that target. The SBTi recognise, rather like water leakage in some respects, you can't just purely eliminate water leakage. We've got to accept that what we want to do is curb the very, very large emitters. And therefore, the SBTi ambition is linked to a critical mass of organisations, being about 20% of businesses in a particular territory or sector, primarily focused on very, very large businesses that will then act almost as a signal to other businesses, but also more recently targeting financial institutions, i.e. fund management companies, to themselves set targets in relation to their organisational SBTi. So the businesses that they invest in, how are they performing? And that will in turn reflect upon the financial institution. So you can see the SBTi recognise this. Financial institutions play a critical role in the system, and that these institutions have special influence over other actors through their investment and lending activities. And we'll consider the specific actors that we look at in relation to financial institutions. We do not just look at fund management companies, we also look at asset owners, i.e. pension funds, who will then give their fund managers a remit to manage. We adopt the lens or the theoretical lens of SBTi as an accounting practice. And we view SBTi validated targets as such an accounting practice. And Power, the way back in 1994, recognised the constitutive role that accounting plays for science. And therefore, we felt there was a nice link here between accounting and science. It is a form of new accounting. It's not financial reporting, but it is a form of new accounting, rather like sustainability is a form of new accounting. So we were keen to explore SBTi targets as an accounting practice because they enable organisational SBTs to be operationalised and made real. They also enable that target emissions are calculable and comparable. They are not just cherry-picked from our, organizational specific targets that they design, but rather they're calculative and comparable based upon the SBTi frameworks. As an accounting practice, we specifically draw on two of its functions. The first one is territorialization, which effectively is where you have an accounting practice that enables you to have a calculative space. So it is calculable and comparable, and it can be operationalized and made real. So territorialization is a very, very key feature. And then secondly, but not to be confused with the term mediating in hybridity, where there might be tensions. So for instance, between, if I was a luxury car producer, there may be a tension between the car production department and the finance department. The car production department thinks they can spend what they like. The finance department wants to restrict them. And we do in the literature come across the idea that a mediating instrument in that sense can try and resolve tensions between the finance department and another department. However, in accounting practice, the mediating instrument fulfills a completely separate purpose. And what it seeks to do is to connect two domains. And those two domains from SBTi point of view are firstly the geopolitical domain, which is reflective of the Paris Agreement, political will, and so on, and the organizational domain. And so the SBTi validated target acts as a mediating instrument between those two domains to provide a substance to that vision, helping to link the present to the future to achieve political, strategic, or operational aspirations. And that quite clearly connects the two domains that we have, the geopolitical domain, which encapsulates Paris, and the organizational domain that captures company emissions. The research questions that we sought to answer were, first of all, what are the features of SBTi as an accounting practice? So what are these territorialization and mediating features? Secondly, in recognizing the financial institutions and the financial institutions framework of SBTi, what role do capital market actors play in embedding SBTi as an accounting practice? And you can see that the second quote that I'm just putting a little cursor on down here from Miller and O'Leary, we need a fuller understanding of how this process of embedding is achieved. What practices or instruments help link the actions and expectations of actors across formally separate and diverse domains? So in a way, what we were recognizing is that it's all very well having an accounting practice, but what makes it embedded? Why should companies adopt SBTi? So what is the process behind the embedding of SBTi as an accounting practice? Because if only a handful of companies across the world adopted it, clearly it would have no traction. And therefore, there has to be a mechanism whereby an accounting practice becomes embedded and used. Otherwise, it will just wither and die. The first two questions are quite positive. The third research question is, what are the constraints impairing this embeddedness of SBTi as an accounting practice? And so we were very keen on exploring the quote from Miller and O'Leary, also Charnock more recently, that mediating instruments connecting domains in such a context should be more examined. And therefore we hope that our research will help address those previous calls to explore the embedding process. I'm going to hand over to Stuart now before I move into the literature in a little bit more detail. for Stuart just to talk us through what are the target setting frameworks of SBTi.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Hello, everybody. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about this slide and in terms of how this works in a little bit more detail. So obviously, as Richard was explaining, we have a situation where at the geopolitical global level, we believe there is an amount of carbon that can be emitted within the atmosphere that will lead to different levels of temperature thresholds. And so, climate science clearly is very key here in the scenarios that they run, the pathways that they look at to try and help us understand how much carbon can be emitted in the future if we are to reach those political aspirations of the Paris Agreement. So there's a carbon budget of a total amount of carbon that we can emit looking forwards. The second step here is that then we need to look at that in terms of how that is distributed over time. So there's different scenarios in play as to how that total carbon budget can be sort of distributed over the future years as we look to it. Let's say if we imagine a net zero world in 2050, how do we get there and how do we spread that budget from 2025 to 2050? So that's sort of at the global level. And then, as Richard was explaining, one of the key elements here that we're interested in is how do we take those scenarios, that global level budget, and say, well, for each individual company, what does that mean for you? What does it mean for, an oil producer? Or what does it mean for a supermarket, whatever it might be, the different companies that are all emitting to some extent carbon, but they are, different industries, different sectors. So how does that actually get allocated it? And so this is where the SBTi framework fits in, is it offers an allocation approach whereby companies can follow a deliberate methodology through which they, within their own sector, within their region, can try to look at how within this methodology their own targets need to be set to be match the more global aspiration. And this is important for SBTi as their starting point, really, for the way that they wanted to think about the contribution they could make to getting organizations to move towards a Paris Agreement scenario. And Richard's already mentioned it, but just a couple of other things I want to say on this slide that sort of are key to what piqued our interest here. First of all, SBTi's theory of change and this assumption that if you get a critical mass of 20% of businesses in a territory or in a sector to sign up, then that will be sufficient for it to get a life of its own, for it to be influential and for it to make markets take this seriously. But when we look at SBTi and the success they've had over the last, probably let's say 7 or 8 years, they're currently, or the end of 2025, had 8,416 companies with validated science-based targets. Now, of course, that doesn't sound very much when we think about the number of companies we have emitting carbon in the global business sector. But if we just take a step back and look at the reports from the SBTi and think about as Richard said, the importance of the companies that are signing up, what they reported by the end of 2023, which was when approximately 4,200 companies were signed up, that the market capitalization of those companies with validated targets, plus those companies that had committed to set validated targets, had a market capitalization of nearly 46 trillion, and that this represented a 39% penetration for SBTi. So yes, the numbers in absolute terms of companies still seems quite low, but in terms of, the global influence and the global power of these organizations is very significant. And finally, on this slide, just to again reiterate, I think Richard's already covered it really, but the importance within this of the recognition of SBTi, that an important role here is for financial institutions. And at the time of we started our interviews, that we'll come back to later, one of the key pieces of work that SBTi were undertaking was finalizing their financial institutions framework, which is now going from some sort of level of strength to strength with 165 financial institutions now signed up to their financial institutions framework. But as I say, we'll come back to that later. But that's just a bit of an overview for how the SBTi target setting framework takes what is a global target, a budget, and takes that through time and allocates it to organizations. So I'll hand back to Richard there.
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, critically on the financial institutions framework, obviously fund managers themselves will not have a massive emissions profile, but through their investing activities, they will. And therefore, at the financial institutions framework level, the criteria is based upon their portfolio coverage of companies that they hold within their portfolio, the percentage of companies, and are those companies signed up to those targets. So if you are Legal and General, for instance, and you've signed up to the financial institutions framework, you then need to look at your investment portfolio to see how many of your investee companies are complying and signing up with validated SBTi targets. So that's where the very lever is coming from if those companies weren't already signed up. So it's very, very important, the financial institutions framework, to help embed SBTi within organizations. So the SBTi literature itself is relatively small. Obviously, there's lots and lots of diverse literature on climate change reporting, but in terms of SBTi, relatively small. A lot of it quite descriptive. So Bjorn et al. Recognized the growing emphasis of SBTi targets, which was apparent from Stuart's overview of the frameworks. Gishcombe did report that one prominent example of such approach is the science-based targets. That was also recognized by Farry and Labouton. One way that companies can receive recognition is through science-based targets initiative. And lastly, Bjorn et al., that science-based targets appear to have provoked a steadily unfolding paradigm shift towards climate change targets. Now, a lot of that research or those pieces of research is really quite descriptive and looking at, what is an SBTi, what number of organizations have signed up to it, are targets going up or going down, are they being adopted? And then kind of stop there. That's rather simplistic, I know, but they're really just commenting on that SBTi is a recognized target setting method. Clarion, more recently, they highlighted a series of constraints. This was entirely desk-based research looking at SBTi documents, and they noted some of the constraints, that time frames of the target period might be variable, the baseline year of emissions might be variable, the scope might be variable, whether to include or exclude scope 3, for example, and the use of intensity versus absolute emissions target. I'm going to come back to a lack of post-verification monitoring in a moment. But looking just at the variable time frames of the target period and the baseline year, really that's inherent in the business setting its target, because every business will have a different target period, possibly determined by the industry it's in, and the baseline year, which will stem from the year that the SBTi target was validated. So in a way, it's unsurprising that they do have variable timeframes and baseline years. Lack of post-verification monitoring mechanisms, however, is what we would look at and say is a genuine constraint, because it's all very well setting a target and having the target validated, but what happens to the subsequent reporting of that? Is the reporting of that voluntary or compulsory? Is there a post-verification mechanism in order to look at these targets? It's rather like setting a budget for any business and then saying, don't worry, we're not going to monitor it, in which case then the budget would have far less meaning and value. So there was this concern as to a lack of, in a way, accountability architecture through a lack of this post-verification monitoring. And we will come back to that. And it has been addressed. Bjorn et al., in terms of, they've already highlighted some good news in terms of company adoption is going up, but some bad news in that there's lower levels of diffusion in low and middle income countries and in certain emission intensive sectors and across the SME market. So it is patchy. And for instance, certain US states, the companies there will probably not be in a hurry to sign up to it, and that's being very clearly signalled to them that's fine by the current government there. So we know it's patchy, but nonetheless, that doesn't mean we should stop trying to do it. We know there's a diversity of carbon reporting approaches, and that's why Stuart went through the framework that companies may adopt different methods, but what we've got to bear in mind is that those methods ultimately will lead to us trying to control climate change to within 1.5% over a time period. And therefore, if they report carbon one way or another, so long as the ultimate goal remains at the 1.5% degree level rather, then that fulfills the needs of the Paris Agreement. There is a mixed picture of progress, and it does vary significantly by target scope, especially within scope 3, because inherently that's more difficult to measure. Now, we talked very much about what we considered, and SBTi consider, the importance of investors. And this plays into the financial institutions framework and also our research question too. So we also reviewed the sort of more practice-based literature. What are investors saying about SBTi targets? So for instance, the Financial Reporting Council, climate change and how companies are responding to the risks that it poses are at the forefront of the minds of investors, regulators, and other users of reporting. From SBTi, rather, this is bound to almost say financial institutions are important, because clearly they are important for the framework to be embedded. But financial institutions play a catalytic role for the net zero alignment of portfolios through utilising engagement and investment levers to drive real world transformation. And then one from the Pension Protection Fund Climate Change Report, we view the SBTi commitment or approved target as a key metric for evaluating companies' ambition. And it's been instrumental in improving the assessment of Paris alignment of many of our portfolio companies. We will encourage more and more companies to set robust science-based targets. And that's echoed by many other pension funds. This idea that there is a key metric that an asset owner can rely on investee companies that have got this key metric and they are using it. And Schroders, as a fund manager, we have committed to aligning all our managed in-scope assets to a 1.5 degree world by 2040 through the Science Based Targets Initiative. Not through whatever each company wants to do, but rather very specifically, and that would form part of the financial institutions framework that they have committed to, and they're going to achieve that or help their companies achieve that through science-based targets. In terms of the theoretical foundations, and I'll cover this for approximately 5 minutes and then I'll hand over to Stuart. I've talked before about territorialization to make visible and calculable something that may have been previously invisible, although clearly it was gaining visibility, but incalculable and certainly not comparable when every company was doing its own thing. The space created is something around which an envelope can be drawn and from which calculations can be made. And new calculative practices are developed. Some may succeed and become embedded, and some may fail. So, and there's many calculative practices outside of financial reporting. For instance, the whole of sustainability reporting will rely upon new calculative practices coming to the fore, some remaining and being embedded and successful, and others less so. In my time, I suppose, when I was qualifying an accountant, we would have more and more things like triple bottom line accounting, or we had inflation accounting, which was an accounting practice. And obviously, inflation accounting was the subject of a statement of accounting practice that failed for various reasons. So not all calculative practices become sustained and embedded. I talked earlier about mediating instrument, providing a link between separate domains. And in our world, the link between the geopolitical domain and the organizational domain, and those connections to help fulfill strategic or operational aspirations. I've reused the quote about the importance of understanding this process of embedding and how that is achieved. And I've briefly touched upon why failure might be the norm, failure which sets in train further reform and new efforts to account, because not every calculative practice will succeed. I'm just going to very quickly draw on the functions and the connections of SBTi. So you can see we've got SBTi in green as sort of the center of this figure. Domain 1 is climate science, such as the IPCC, along with global political change through the Paris Agreement. We've got to then connect Domain 1 through to Domain 2 organizations. So the SBTi is the accounting practice that will fulfill that, but we also say that that will be levered by asset owners and pension funds that in their pressure with asset and fund managers will put more direct pressure on organizations to commit to SBTi. Now, I just saw a question coming in the chat, which I think we'll come back to that, if I may, Mohammed, around Miller and Powers' theory. Rather than do it now, let us consider that when we've done the discussion, if that's okay. And that brings us into the research method. And at that point, I will hand over to Stuart.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Yeah. So I think Richard's already mentioned this, but just for a bit of background, our original plan was to conduct a qualitative analysis of disclosures made by companies that have SBTi approved targets. So companies that have SBTi approved targets are required or expected to produce in some form a public announcement of their progress against target each year. So it's not that they're not being asked to do that, but there's two sort of aspects to it that are relatively weak. One is that's all it says. So there's no detailed guidelines on what that disclosure would look like. And two is there's no requirement for that to be assured in any way. So when we were actually looking at the disclosures, we found, as I think, as Richard said, a whole range of disclosures in different places. Some were very minimal, basically a sentence in the CEO letter saying, we have a science-based target of whatever it was. And that was it. That was all they said. And as part of that, all SBTi themselves do is we don't have a quote, I think, in the presentation, but we do in the paper, where they adopt what they called a parroting approach, where they would just in their own annual report, where they reflect on the progress of SBTi, they just report back or sort of copy what the companies are saying rather than any form of um, assurance or any form of sort of testing what's being said. So I think it became relatively quickly clear to us that just an analysis of the disclosures wasn't going to get us very far. So based on that, we decided that we personally had sufficient interest in the topic to undertake some primary research, which started with 6 interviews with 6 senior representatives from SBTi themselves. They were kind enough to give us some access to speak to different people within the organization. And we undertook those as a first step. And it was an important first step for us because despite, taking quite a lot of care to look at what SBTi was available on their website and looking at their own documentation around their processes, around their methodologies, we still felt that we didn't have a deep understanding of SBTi and what it was trying to achieve. So a very important first step for us, or second step, I suppose, was to speak to SBTi. And I suppose two of the things that really shone through from those interviews, we'll come back to some of the detailed quotes later, was the further emphasis at that time that they were placing on financial institutions and the development of the financial institution framework. But also this idea of this theory of change that was, key to their sort of way that they were thinking about their potential influence across different companies, across different regions, and across different sectors. So that was very interesting, and that was something that led us to think more about how we would want to sort of take the next stage of the research forward. And going back again to this idea of the importance of the financial institutions, what led us to then undertake a series of 16 interviews with a total of 18 interviewees with representatives from the investor community, which we code as AO and AM, so asset owners and asset managers in the paper. And just again to reiterate, probably something that Richard said is that, at the starting point, we had our research questions. We were very much taking an exploratory approach to try and understand this. We didn't have a set theory in mind. We weren't sort of wedded to mediating instruments or anything like that at the start of this process. So it very much was once, as we were undertaking the interviews and as we were thinking about our analysis, we were very much taking an iterative process, going back from the data to the themes being developed through our coding and then starting to link that with the theory that we felt fitted best. And I can sort of just quickly touch on Mohammed's question here. I mean, absolutely. I think both Richard and I are very aware of institutional theory and actor network theory, and they did form part of our conversations. But I think, what we came back to all the time was the best fit, the clearest fit with the data and the storyline that we were seeing develop from our own data didn't offer to us sufficient additional on top of what we already had with the theoretical framing that we've got in the paper as it stands at the moment. We're very happy to hear other people's views on that. So we move towards a theorized storyline that's drawing on these ideas of the functions of accounting as an accounting practice. And I suppose one final thing just to say on research method, I don't want to spend too long on this, but just to say, one of my pet topics is how many papers talk about in vivo. And just to say, we don't use in vivo. We're very much using Excel spreadsheets as our approach to sort of help us do our coding and to keep on track of our process. So yes, I'm sure in vivo is very powerful and very useful, but it's not essential. You can do these things either on paper or with spreadsheets as well. And we spent a lot of time back and forth with our Excel spreadsheets, doing our separate coding and then working together to look at our agreements or disagreements on how we've done that coding. So can we move on to the next slide, Richard? So just going to talk through some of the findings now, and some of it hopefully, won't be too surprising given how we've tried to set out the front end of the paper. But first thing to say is, as I said earlier, we perceive SBTi to be an accounting practice. We perceive that it has developed specific methodologies, tools, and techniques for organizations to undertake a very specific calculation, a calculation of their future targets and a pathway of a scenario through which they can be aligned with the Paris Agreement. And we see that very much as a form of calculative practice that is an accounting practice. So key to that is the way in which these frameworks and methodologies are perceived by the people that will use them. Obviously, SBTi themselves have created these frameworks, these methodologies, but it's not them that are going to use them. It is organizations that are going to use them. So we're looking at it from that perspective. We're seeing them develop that. And then we see through that SBTi very much serving as a mediating instrument between the domains, from the climate science in particular. So we've talked about the geopolitical, but also the role that climate science plays in the way that they position themselves and how they explicitly refer, both in their own name, of course, to science, but also in their mission and in the way that they approach their, so I suppose, how they sell themselves as a relevant organization is very much through the reference back to climate science and Science at the Times. So next slide, please, Richard. So what we found as key enabling features of SBTi, and again, just to refer back to why we're finding this interesting, is obviously SBTi could have created these methodologies and been completely ignored, or completely, just a few companies. I think their very initial ambition was for 100 companies to sign up and to set science-based targets. So they could have just stopped there. It could have been a very small sort of side project where a very small number of very keen companies did a small amount of work and created a science-based target. But very quickly, it obviously began to spread and began to go much beyond having 100 companies signed up. And as we saw earlier, there's now over 8,000 companies with approved targets. And so what has led to that success? What has led to it being embedded and becoming enabled within organizations? And we got a few very, strong messages back from our interviews, both obviously from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, but also with the asset owners and the asset managers as well. So first of all was the rigor of the methodology, or the perceived rigor of the methodology. We were aware that not everybody would agree that SBTi methodologies are perfect, but they are perceived as rigorous by asset owners. In this case, asset owner one is talking about how investors actually believe in the rigorous methodologies that SBTi set out. And then alongside that, a key part of enabling the practice to become embedded, to become more embedded in practice, is this idea that it is available. And so SBTi themselves very clearly wanted that to be the case, and have so made their standards open source, so that there is that transparency, and hopefully they believe will build trust in the marketplace. And another very important part of, or another enabling feature, if you like, as we've been calling it, is the fact that SBTi themselves, as well as having the methodology publicly available, but for it to be a true SBTi target, they independently verify that target the company sets. So they are undertaking a process through which they are validating the company's targets once they're set, and making sure that they do adhere to the process that they've gone through within SBTi. Next slide, please, Richard. So very much, if we look at the way in which this is being perceived, I think I already mentioned some of this, but I really want to emphasize how important this association with science is in the eyes of both SBTi, so that's S4 is a representative of SBTi, but also within the capital market actors, so asset owners and asset managers. And this was a very common theme that was coming through from our interviews, is that actually for this to be a success, if you like, or for this to be adopted, one of the key messages coming back was this is about what the science is telling us we need to do. This is aligned with climate science. It's the rigor, the science behind it. And so very much it appears from our interviews with these asset owners and asset managers is there has been a successful attempt from SBTi to clearly align themselves with climate science and to get that link through to the science that has been achieved through their own explicit attempts to align themselves with climate science and has been accepted by asset owners and asset managers. Alongside that, we also have here the final quote here. Just I won't read it out, but I thought it was one quote that really encapsulated the sort of strong messaging we were getting from asset owners and asset managers about why SBTi in their eyes was having this traction within the marketplace, was being adopted, and quite the phrase that's often used is exponential growth. There's exponential growth in the number of companies that have signed up, and it's around the independent verification, the rigor and the science that was being very strongly, applauded and valued within the marketplace. Next slide, please, Richard. And then, so the second set of findings was more specifically around what role do capital market actors have in embedding this this practice more within practice within companies as well. So how are they helping to spread it to have this diffusion across different actors? And a big part of that is this influence that financial institutions have over their investee companies. And they're certainly very keen, and SBTi are very keen to see that influence being used by investors. So we see the quote there from S4, where they are explicitly looking to work collaboratively with top capital market actors as a way in which they can see that those actors can help them to institutionalize and drive the uptake of science-based targets. So in a way, there's a synergy there between SBTi's own goals for this critical mass and the way in which capital market actors can help them achieve that. And so they also talk about the financial institution framework as a key element of that, and this direct relationship they see between SBTi, investors and companies. And it was sort of reflected in the diagram that we developed earlier that Richard showed briefly earlier, where we were trying to think about the different domains and also the different actors and the relationships between them. And we see that there is that direct relationship with those investors, the asset managers and the asset owners, actually being directly related to both SBTi and to the companies sitting between them. And specifically about the fifth, and again, I know that Richard mentioned this, but this idea that as the capital market actors sign up to the financial institutions framework, they are required to set targets for their own portfolio coverage. So if you get one financial institution to sign up, that's effectively going to influence a lot of companies. It's, within their portfolio, it's going to have a larger impact. So if you like, one financial institution is worth many companies in terms of the influence it has. Okay, we'll carry on, Richard, to the next slide, please. So what, as well as this sort of role, how do capital market actors, how do they actually sort of manage to have this influence to create this process of embedding? And they clearly have a very important role. So the first quote on this slide is talking about how asset owners are starting to engage with companies around what they are seeing as a requirement. They say nobody really disagrees with the SBTi. For us as investors, it's very easy to say, this is our one concrete ask, sign up to the Science Based Target Initiative. And similarly for the second quote there from the asset managers, talking about, why companies are getting a bit obsessed by these things is because some fund managers are specifically talking about excluding or divesting from companies that don't have an SBTi target. So we can see here in those first two quotes a direct relationship both from asset owners and from asset managers to companies, putting influence and pressure upon them to sign up to SBTi. But then in the second half of this slide, what we also see is very much there's a pressure from asset owners to asset managers as well. So not only do asset owners seek to directly influence companies, they're also seeking to influence asset managers as well. So if you get asset owners to embrace it, as Asset Manager One says, then asset managers will embrace it as well. So there's this strengthening of the influence here through the role that asset owners can both directly engage with companies, but also indirectly through their pressure they can apply onto asset managers. And the same with the asset owners here, the asset owner two, talking about how they look at the SBTi scores and how they are signaling to let their asset managers know that they want data on the extent to which companies are signing up to SBT. Okay, next slide, please, Richard. So we can see from this point that, our argument or our data, we were feeling that there was definitely a sense and a storyline emerging of how we can see that the SBTi has managed to territorialize a new accounting practice. It appears to be successfully mediating between the science and the Paris Agreement through to organizations. And even the way in which the capital market actors have been sort of enrolled to help create this flow of pressure that was helping to embed SBTi as a practice across companies. But that would be sort of an unfair half story if we stopped there, because actually alongside that, we very much saw that there were some constraints, some which are consistent with the literature that Richard talked earlier, but some which I think we take a little bit further, that can still lead to SBTi perhaps not being as influential in the future as it would like to be. And if you remember, its target is to try and achieve critical mass this year. Well, sorry, last year, 2025. We're now in 2026, aren't we? So, was to try and achieve this 20% critical mass across regions and across different sectors by 2025. And so similar to one of the findings of Bjorn et al., very much so, was that, and I think Richard used the word patchy, that take-up is different in different regions and in different sectors across the world. So we very much, found evidence from our interviews of different regions. I mean, I've picked out here, the China and some US states where it was argued that, the language there is very different. There are cultural differences. And, so the idea that SBTi will be able to achieve critical mass across all regions, across all sectors, by 2025, for example, was being challenged as perhaps unrealistic and a real challenge for SBTi. More generically, the bottom quote here is talking about how, yes, SBTi is attempting to create this critical mass, and we've seen how asset owners and asset managers are perhaps influential in helping to try and achieve that. But at the end of the day, SBTi remains voluntary. And if a company doesn't want to sign up, a company doesn't have to sign up. And, there's no, as far as we're aware, there's no regulatory push specifically related to science-based targets from global governments. So there's very much at the global geopolitical domain, there is an issue here for the SBTi in that it doesn't have that level of support at individual level to try and push its further use more in a more regulatory framework. The next slide, please, Richard. And then if we look at it at the organizational level, we definitely saw, or definitely heard, I should say, from both SBTi and asset managers and asset owners, that companies are still reticent. They're still holding back from signing up to Science-Based Targets initiative. And the most commonly stated reasons for that are these first two, reflected in these first two quotes on this slide. So the first is the idea of being more frightened about the implications of not reaching your target. So there was very much a sense that, if you put your head above the parapet and you set a challenging science-based target and then fail to meet it, you will be heavily criticized. And so there's a danger that there's a negativity that will follow if you try and set a challenging, science-based target. And alongside that is this idea that you're being asked to set a target looking significantly into the future, where you can't at this point in time say exactly how you're going to meet that target. What technology is going to enable you to meet that target? Exactly how are the different initiatives going to be costed? Can you afford the different initiatives that you need to do? So very much in the organizational domain, there was reticence from different organizations, pushback to both asset managers and asset owners about, whether it was a realistic ask for them to ask companies to sign up for the Science-Based Target Initiative. There's also very much a pushback or a constraint about the level of adoption of the financial institution framework specifically as well. It's similar in a way in that we talked about organizations being reticent, but I think it was more strongly emphasized that financial institutions generally are quite cautious. And so again, if they sense that setting a target that would not be achievable, then that would be a challenging request for a financial institution. So the first quote there talks about the quite cautious approach of financial institutions. And this concern that, because of that, it might be challenging to get the financial community to sign up en masse. Now, of course, since our interviews, we've seen that more and more financial institutions have signed up, and there does appear to be a growing number of financial institutions signing up, but it's still relatively small numbers in absolute terms. Next slide, please, Richard. And then two other final constraints specifically, or three actually, more specifically at the SBTi level. So one of the things that was very much come back to, and I guess we see it in many of the different sustainability reporting literatures, is this term, the alphabet soup, this different number of initiatives that different organizations could choose to follow. So SBTi is not the only game in town, if you like. It's not the only initiative that companies could sign up to. Another one is the Transition Pathway Initiative, or there's the Climate Action 100 Plus group, or there's even, within our more well-established databases now, different attempts to try and integrate climate change targets within there. So, there's different players and there's different possibilities for organizations to choose different initiatives as their way of signaling they care about climate change. And that's clearly a challenge for SBTi is, so we didn't include it on the slides, I think, but what we did see is in some interviews, people say, yes, SBTi is gaining traction. It is the horse that people are betting on, is I think one of the quotes that we had where people were saying that is sort of people have identified SBTi as the way forward, but clearly they're not the only game in town. There are other possibilities. The second one, which is links back to what Richard was talking about earlier, is this lack of accountability architecture following through the subsequent progress against validated targets. So again, just to reiterate, SBTi, if we could just go back a slide, Richard, the SBTi do validate the target at the time of target setting, and they do require companies to report or disclose their progress against target. But there is no sort of there's no need for the companies to get that assured, that progress assured, and there's no need for the companies, or there's no requirement in the initial SBTi framework for that to be sort of proven in any way. They just have to say, this is our target, this is our progress. So very much coming from our interviews, there was this idea that the big signal for the market would be to start to develop this idea that people would be able to sort of accredit or review the targets, and to review the progress against the targets would make a big difference. So that was definitely coming through from our interviews as a constraint on the potential for this to grow further, is that the people within the capital markets were still wanting more. They were wanting more from this to be able to see it as a successful initiative. And the final constraint here was that the SBTi itself was set up a number of years ago. It's an initiative which brought together resources from 4 different organizations, but it was never designed or set up to be an organization that would be monitoring post-monitoring process, and was never expecting to be even validating 8,000 companies targets. As I say, the very initial target was to have 100 companies sign up. So this exponential growth and the requirement for target in terms of staffing for the SBTi themselves has been a real challenge. Thanks, Richard. Next slide, please. So I think just quickly to highlight some of the key elements of the discussion that we're talking about. So I think, in Richard's and my mind and our conversations, and as we've been developing the paper, we're quite convinced that this is a new accounting practice that has been created, a new form of accounting that has enabled companies to undertake calculated practices to quantify science-based targets across a validated process. So we're quite confident, if you like, that is something that we're seeing, and it is making these targets become more visible as companies are required to disclose their progress against it. We're equally quite convinced that SBTi has been quite successful in demonstrating their alignment, or convincing, I should say, probably, key actors of their alignment with both climate science and with the Paris Agreement. So this link from organizations to the geopolitical domain or the climate science domain, we believe has been quite successful for SBTi. We believe they've been able to do that, and that has been, within our interviews at least, been successfully portrayed, and the different interviewees have been quite happy that they are convinced that is the case, that is what is happening. Next slide, please, Richard. But just to remind you what our key questions were, the first was about whether or how this process of embedding can be achieved. And we do feel that what we found in our interviews is a key role for the capital market actors, both asset owners and asset managers, and how their influence has been encouraged from SBTi, and then has a direct and sometimes indirect impact on companies signing up as well. So we believe that these actors are very important in embedding SBTi as a practice within organizations. But against that, what we are getting a sense of is that the capital market actors, the asset owners and the asset managers, actually want something a little bit more as well. So the capital market actors were very happy that the target itself was validated, and they were very convinced that the target setting process was aligned with science. That was all very well accepted. But they were starting to ask for more. They were starting to ask for this idea that, well, we want to know how companies are progressing against target. It's not enough for the companies to have a validated target. We want to know how they do this. In our minds, this is another of the functions of accounting from Miller and Power, is that what the capital market actors actually want, as alongside a territorialized practice, a mediating instrument, is they want to be able to adjudicate. They want to be able to judge companies, and they judge the companies against the progress. So they want to be able to adjudicate a company's performance against its target, which currently isn't possible. And so this is a real issue for SBTi. It was not something that they originally sort of signed up to do. They never had the intention of doing that as an organization. It was never something that they had planned to do. But there is now this sort of line within our paper that we're getting a clear message that is what organizations would like, or sorry, asset owners and asset managers would like as a next step. They want this idea of adjudication. So next slide, please, Richard. Um, so will SBTi fail? Well, of course it may fail, and it may fail because perhaps it isn't quite achieving what capital market actors would like it to achieve. If it isn't offering this accountability architecture, then it might be that some of the other alternative systems in this crowded landscape might be seen as being more valuable or more helpful to what different actors would like to do, because they want to take this adjudicating role forward. So there is a real danger there. But this has been recognised by the Science Based Target Initiative, and in their more recent, so this is subsequent to our own interviews, in their more recent documents that they've been releasing, they're encouraging companies that are signed up to have what they call a validation cycle, where they are looking for companies to validate and have their progress against target being followed and approved over time. So there is that as an issue. Clearly, we also saw this concern over, it's doing particularly well in certain regions in the world and certain sectors, but there are equally regions and sectors where perhaps the need or the political argument isn't as strong, and so the sign up within organizations isn't strong as well. And one final point here is one of the other elements of the mediating instrument is not only to mediate between the organization and the geopolitical domain, but also to mediate from today through to the future. And that is the nature of targets, of course, but that uncertainty and that challenge of meeting targets has created reticence within organizations. So it's obviously a fundamental part of target setting. It's at its essence, but it's also a problem for the Science Based Target Initiative. So I think we've just got one more slide, Richard. So I don't think there's too much more to say on this slide. I think we've kind of covered it. So just very briefly, in terms of our conclusion, we do believe that, this practice is developing. We do believe that the practice is becoming embedded within organizations, and it continues to grow as an initiative in terms of the number of companies signed up. So it's something we're going to continue to follow. We think it's an interesting and relatively or potential, I should say, potentially powerful initiative that is having some influence in the world. It will be interesting to see where it goes next. But I think we could probably stop there, and I think there have been already some questions in the chat, but I know I've been talking, so I should probably stop there unless Richard wants to add anything at that point.
No, I don't have anything to add. I think we should probably explore some of the questions in the chat. And then we can also see if any other attendees have any other questions. So I think I'll stop sharing at this point, if that's all right.
Yes, thank you very much, dear Professor Stewart and Professor Richard, for your contribution, and it's really an excellent presentation. Now, if you can have any questions in the chat, okay, you can reply for it. And if anyone have any questions, he or she can open her mic or his mic and ask her questions.
Thanks, Bernard. Shall I start, Richard, or would you like to?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I think, Mohammed, your first question I sort of touched upon. I mean, it'd be interesting to hear your views, actually, now we've presented it and you've seen the paper, but I can understand your point about the power relations. And we do feel that is important, the influence that the capital market actors have. And certainly as part of our discussion, we do reflect on the fact that compared to where we were at the start, we recognize actually that the capital market actors were even more powerful in this setting than we perhaps imagined at the start. Let's put it that way. But we didn't feel the need because of that to rely on institutional theory or power theory, theory of power, or even I think the other one you mentioned was actor network theory, wasn't it? But I'm very happy for you to share your thoughts if you would like to.
No, thanks. It's clear, and I will send you the paper in the mail, and this I will Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And then I think your second question was around we do highlight a positive role for SBTi. You're absolutely right. I think you asked whether there was any fundamental criticisms of SBTi. I think there's two that immediately come to mind. I don't know if they're fundamental, but anyway, two major criticisms of SBTi. The first is this lack of post monitoring framework, so post setting of the target, is that was very much a concern of the different, certainly a number of different actors, that, that's what they felt that was needed within the setting. Was it's not enough just to have a validated target. It is also needed that we then review progress against that target if we're really going to achieve progress, if you like. So that was definitely one. And I'd say the other one that comes to mind is that we definitely had, I can't remember if it was one or two interviewees that were very much thinking of the transition pathway initiative, for example, as the way forward, as the better initiative that they personally felt was a better way or better mechanism through which to try and align future emissions alongside the science-based target, alongside climate science. So I'd say they were the main two, unless Richard, you would like to add anything there.
No, I think you've reflected that well. They were the two um, constraints that came together. And I mean, just in terms of developing the research, we were led by the data. We didn't know what constraints may emerge. Some of the constraints have been partially addressed by SBTi. For instance, in terms of the staffing levels, they have invested in more and more staff. They are looking at, they do now have a post validation monitoring mechanism. In a way that goes hand in hand with the staff. So yeah, clearly there are constraints, but equally, it does serve as a positive mechanism. And in a way, that brings me on. I'd like to just address Gerard's point that he's made on the chat about breaching the 1.5 degree target, which we recognise. Is this a case of corporations co-opting the agenda to deflect attention while they continue with business as usual? I would partly refute that, I think, in terms of, had organisations been allowed to set their own targets and just set soft targets and then say, oh, look how good we are. But I would say we are moving away from business as usual because, one, the target has got to be verified or validated. And two, in a way, they're not going to fool our investors. Certainly, if those investors have signed up to the financial institutions framework, they're well versed on what sort of targets are realistic in terms of achieving the aspirations of Paris, and won't just side with soft targets, nor will SBTi. One of the early disclosure studies that we looked at when we thought this might be a disclosure paper, and we looked at sort of climate change reporting disclosure, and it was one of the retailers that shouted from the rooftops about how good they were because they had targets and so on. And really, all they were doing was signalling that they had targets. Whether they were verified or not, I can't remember. Whether there was any post-target reporting, I can't remember. So I think without this framework that is independent and it is rigorous and it does link to science, I think it would be business as usual. But I would go on the more positive aspect that I think through SBTi as an accounting practice, organisations can hide a bit less. Um, and I think that's where I would come from. Stuart, do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously aware of criticisms of SBTi and the specifics around some of their methodology, and Richard and I certainly saw the controversy last year when SBTi changed their stance on carbon offsetting as well. So I don't think we're trying to say it's perfect. I think there's two elements to it. One is we do see that it is a trying to achieve a position where it is linked to science and it has that rigor around it. Um, but clearly, at the moment, we still have a number of companies signed up and a much vaster number of companies that aren't signed up. And, I mean, yes, it is, of course, been a whole emphasis of our research. The reason why we undertook this research is our own personal concerns over climate change and the way in which the 1.5 degree target is, it's not looking great, is it? To be honest, so absolutely. It's not that we're trying to dismiss that as a concern. We're absolutely trying to raise that and saying that we need initiatives that take that global concern and give tools that will enable companies and organizations to take action. And we think this is one. We're not saying it's perfect. We're not saying it alone can solve the problems of the world, but we do think it is doing a job of some sort.
Just to clarify, my question really wasn't about SBTi as a platform, as a strategy. I'm not criticizing that. I think that's important. It is more in terms of how corporations respond to it, and I'm very skeptical of the corporate response. I mean, anecdotally, you can look. Unilever, for instance, which did a lot of leading on sustainable living plans, etc., has pulled back when Paul Pullman retired. So, in general, I think there is this practice of hypocrisy and playing to different audiences that corporations engage in. And to the extent that SBTi can make them more transparent, I think it would be very useful. But at the same time, I think they are still looking for ways to look good without being good. And I think that's the big question for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, obviously, we know organizational hypocrisy, greenwashing has been rife under voluntary settings. Uh, and I do think, I mean, so we've had conversations around the extent to which SBTi can be successful in what it wants to achieve, and there are clearly many, many potential problems with what could happen and how organizations could be hypocritical in their approach to that. We're aware of it absolutely, and I do think that the one thing we come back to is that there does appear to be some rigor here and some powerful influence that will have some influence. As I say, I don't want to go too far and say it's going to work, but yeah.
And I think that links it a little bit into Marwa's question, which is around how can we ensure that these targets lead to real emission reductions rather than becoming symbolic or compliance driven. I think I would look at that from two ways. First of all, the targets need to be rigorous and are validated by the SBTi. The second one is being addressed in terms of the post-verification monitoring. Because without that, yes, we can set targets, but then if they're not monitored, like I said earlier, we can set a budget, but if it's not monitored, it doesn't mean anything. So I think the targets in their formation are not symbolic because they are independently validated. But then they could become symbolic if there's then no follow-up action. And I think that's the very important, and that's why we recognise that as one of the critical constraints that came across very clearly from the asset owners and asset managers. I'll just make sure we've addressed all of the other. Oh, wait, just another question from Marwa. But in terms of where you might, the most reliable source for data disclosure, I would say probably not annual reports or sustainability reports, although because companies report such a wide amount of things. Although once the SBTi post-validation framework is in place, then the annual reporting of SBTi and targets would be suitable. And the SBTi databases are good in that they set out whether an organisation is committed or validated. If you are committed, you have, is it 18 months to go, or something like that, Stuart? 18 months?
18 months to 2 years, I think.
Yeah, to get a validated target. Thereafter, you then disappear. So the SBTi database is good because it does set out what the target is.
I think their monitoring report they will publish each year is quite helpful.
Yeah.
So it does take this parroting approach where it doesn't sort of check anything, but it repeats what companies have told them about their progress and about their targets. So each year they produce a monitoring report that's quite a useful resource, I think.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi, thank you very much for the excellent and insightful presentation. I have one question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
That's fine.
How do companies typically integrate the SBTi's targets into their overall corporate strategy and governance structure rather than just treating them as a separate sustainability initiative? Thank you.
It's a very good question. It is beyond the remit of our research. We haven't looked internally at organisations and their governance. I think it would be a fascinating piece of research to do, to take an SBTi validated company and see what effect it had internally on the company's governance, reporting issues, who was involved with it, what their relationship was like with SBTi, what their relationship was like with investors, probably at a fund manager level. But in terms of this paper, then we haven't, that's outside the scope, but a very, very good question.
Thank you so much.
I think the next question might have been from Cynthia about the inside out perspective and the shift towards ISSB. So I think there's two things there. For me is obviously two things is one, I'm still a big believer in impact and inside out. So personally, I think this is very important. But I'd also say even within the ISSB's the S2 standard, they do build on the TCFD requirements, and the TCFD requirements are quite clear that carbon emissions is something that should be reported, and they should be targets associated with that. So, you might not necessarily think as an outside-in approach, it's not obviously something that companies should report, but certainly I would say, even with the ISSB's framework, this is things that I don't believe they mention SBTi specifically, but they do certainly expect companies to report their emissions and to report their targets in this way. So I do think it's still there for now. I mean, of course, if the ISSB were to change S2 and go fully outside in and not see the importance of emissions, maybe that could change. But I still see it as there for now.
Thank you very much.
Let me have a look. Any others? What challenges and adaptations are required to in an emerging country context? I think that would need to be led by the investors. I think there would need to be pressure borne upon corporations in emerging economies. The corporations themselves, we highlighted earlier from the SBTi annual report, that they're well aware that there is low sign up in emerging economies. And what's the push factor to maybe get those corporations to sign up and increase the level of coverage? I think would come from the capital markets, maybe rather than the companies themselves. Because maybe in some economies, and I can't give specifics because I don't know, but maybe in some economies the political will is less. And if the political will is less, then the culture is less in terms of signing up to validated targets, because it's not something that companies may feel they have to do. But I think if you have a global fund manager that's signed up to the financial institutions framework, through that they would then begin to drive pressure on some large companies in emerging economies. That would be my view. But I think left to their own devices, and perhaps left to the political and cultural attributes of those countries, it might be rather slow in forthcoming.
I mean, I think, yeah, absolutely. I think one thing we'd say is that, you know, what one of those constraints we were identifying was that that political will isn't always in place that would really help sort of push this forward. So I don't think there's any easy answer, but of course, capital market actors could be one of the things that some of our asset owners talked about, was being the fact that they are invested throughout the world, and this is a systemic risk for them. And so they will be looking to apply pressure to their whole portfolio, irrespective of where they're based. But of course, you know, that depends on what their portfolio looks like.
And then just from Nahed, which I think is a reflection, can it be introduced into the contemporary issues in accounting course? I'm sure it can be, because it is a contemporary issue. But I think it's kind of a nice question to ask, and seems to reflect well upon the presentation.
I do include, so I do teach a couple of weeks on a contemporary issues in accounting course, and of course I can't stop myself talking about it, so I do include it. So yeah, so it is definitely possible. I think one more question came through just now from customers and suppliers. That is a really good question. I think we got hints about suppliers, perhaps, but I don't think it came through very strongly. I think it was mentioned, possibly, you know, this is from memory now. I'd have to go back and double check our transcripts, but I think from memory, one or two people might have mentioned suppliers, but it wasn't coming through strongly. But that could be because of who we were talking to. So you must remember, we didn't speak to companies themselves. So if we'd have spoken to companies that were signed up, that might, I mean, again, ideas for future projects, that maybe would shed more light on that relationship between, you know, the whole value chain, and whether that was an important mechanism as well. But it's not one we've dealt with, because we were speaking specifically to the capital market actors. And as I say, although a couple of those did mention the supplier influence, it wasn't something that they were focusing on in the same way. But companies themselves, yeah, you might find that coming through more strongly, I think.
Really, thanks for this great discussion and this great topic. But I have two questions. The first one is, do you think that implementing and adapting of this target differ from one country to another according to the nature of its economy and its business? And the second one, how can this target increase the confidence of investors? And thank you.
So I would definitely not say I'm an expert on that, exactly how the SBTi methodology works, but it is certainly, I believe, true to say that within their way in which they take their approaches, the region and the sector is taken into account as to how they look for companies to decarbonize. So I do think there is, so I would imagine, but again, this is where I'm really not confident, that coming from a less developed country would have a different expectation of decarbonisation pathway to a company from a more developed country. But I have to say, you know, that's just, you know, if you go back to the slide that talks about the different allocation approaches, one of the elements there was how their approaches differ by region and by sector. So I think that would influence that. I'd have to look in more detail to be absolutely confident about that. And because I've waffled on, I've forgotten what the second part of the question was. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Can I just pick up Christina's question, which is a pressure to adhere science-based targets coming from customers and suppliers? Again, I mean, we didn't interview other stakeholders, but just thinking this through, certainly in terms of suppliers, organizations with a validated target will need to be reporting on scope 2 emissions, and some will be reporting on scope 3 emissions as well. And therefore, inherently, they will need to be saying to the suppliers, you need to be efficient with your carbon footprint. You know, it might be things like electric lorries and so on. So I think there's pressure that way. Pressure the other way, from a supplier into an organization. Again, if it was a big supplier and they had an SBTi target, I know this is getting a bit far-fetched, but then it would work the other way, because they would feel that they've got to reduce their emissions and they're the supplier. At a customer level, sadly, I'm personally, and I don't have any data on this, sadly, I'm still not that convinced that customers really take, if you're talking about, let's say, retail, or if you are on a gas contract, sadly, I don't think in customers' minds science-based targets or any climate change targets are uppermost. Rather like the welfare of chicken in supermarkets. Everybody says, oh yes, it's very, very important. But then when they go into the supermarket, all they're interested in doing is buying the chicken at the lowest possible price. And so I think at a customer level, I think it would be quite a stretch. Great question.
Hello, this is really a wonderful and timely research topic, and the presentation is really very interesting, and it brings up a lot of research questions. Angie Zahir from the American University in Cairo. I have a question related to the external auditors and how they should take into account the SB's monitoring and trying to put a more restriction. What's the role, and should they take it into account, or they should just rely on their own sources going forward? Thank you.
So in the very latest SBTi announcements, and this is where we were talking, I can't remember what was that called now, the validation cycle. There is now SBTi are recommending, I don't think they're making it compulsory, but they are recommending some assurance of progress against target. That's only just from last year, so I'm not even sure how much that practice has actually spread yet. But certainly, I think that's going back to this idea of what we found the capital market actors were asking for, is this further ability to really adjudicate on what is happening in terms of progress against the target. And SBTi have recognised that, and this is where this I think this is where the validation cycle is going. I think it was only limited assurance that was mentioned. I would have to say that, which obviously we'd love for them to have jumped straight to reasonable or moderate assurance, but I think they only mentioned limited assurance at this point. So yeah, but I do think that is something that capital market actors want, and I do think that is something that certainly from a European EU perspective is clearly something else that's been on the agenda, is trying to increase the expectation again of limited assurance at this point in time, unfortunately. But it is there as being on the agenda, and I think it is something that will continue to develop over time if it gets this traction, if it's recognised as being embedded sufficiently across different markets. Then I think that will be something that will be required over time. And I suppose I'd say the one final comment on Christina's question about the supply chain is clearly with the EU standards, the value chain is part of that. And so there is potential, although we obviously are going through the omnibus simplification program in the EU at the moment, but there is some potential there that if companies were to take the value chain seriously, then that would be potentially a very significant lever mechanism.
Okay, I think we have reached the end of the questions. Thank you all very much. It's been, I've certainly enjoyed it. It's been really good to disseminate the research. The paper's well advanced. Stuart and I are meeting next week. We've got quite a lot of editorial work to do on the paper. Yeah, we're very, we've very much enjoyed doing the paper, and it's really lovely to be able to present it as well. And I think our enthusiasm for the paper hopefully has shone through, and also what the paper does do and what it doesn't do. And that's important for any research if you're relatively a junior or senior in research terms, to make sure the research is always in its bubble, and you don't go down too many avenues that take you away from the research question. So that, I'm always mindful of that, to know the limitations of your research. And I always say to a PhD student, if any of you are PhD students, I don't know, but if you go into a Viva, external examiners may ask you any sorts of questions about the research. If you know the bubble of your research, you should have the confidence to say, my research doesn't address that. My research is within this bubble. It's very interesting, and I can see where that's come from, but this is my research, and that bit isn't. And I think that's very important to know. So that was a free tip at the end.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Mohammed as well for the invitation. Thanks, Mohammed.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Stewart and Professor Richard, for your contribution and excellent presentation. And thank you, everyone, joining us today. And thank you very much for taking the time to present it to us. It's been appreciated. Thank you. And I hope to see you soon in Egypt. You are very, very welcome.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to have a nice weekend.
Thank you very much.
Indeed. Stuart, can